Here, per usual, from Chris Hedges. Before we get into that, quick shout out to the two Uber comrades on Patreon supporting this channel and my content. My partner Rosa and Independent Left News. Definitely check out Independent Left News and please ignore her.
Hey, that's
So
rude.
as you can see, the title, Chris Hedges, The Empire Does Not Forgive. I think you could also say the empire doesn't forgive. It also doesn't learn, is incapable of learning. The Carthaginian general Hannibal, what a great name, who came close to defeating the Roman Republic in the Second Punic War, committed suicide in 181 BC in exile as Roman soldiers closed in on his residence in the Bithynian village of Libya, now modern-day Turkey. It had been more than 30 years since he led his army across the Alps and annihilated Roman legions at the Battle of Trebia, Lake Trasimene and Cannae, considered one of the most brilliant tactical victories in warfare, which centuries later inspired the plans of the German Army Command in World War I, where they invaded Belgium and France and was only able to finally save itself from defeat by replicating Hannibal's military tactics. It did not matter in 181 BC that there had been over 20 Roman consuls with quasi-imperial power since Hannibal's invasion. It did not matter that Hannibal had been hunted for decades and forced to perpetually flee, always just beyond the reach of Roman authorities. He had humiliated Rome, he had punctured its myth of omnipotence, and he would pay with his life. Years after Hannibal was gone, the Romans were still not satisfied. They finished their work of apocalyptic vengeance in 146 BC, so what was that, roughly 40 years after, right? By razing Carthage to the ground and selling its remaining population into slavery. Cato the censor summoned up the sentiments of empire. Carthago delande est. Carthage must be destroyed. Nothing about empire from then until now has changed. Imperial powers do not forgive those who expose their weaknesses and make public the sordid and moral inner workings of empire. Empires are fragile constructions. Their power is as much of one perception as of military strength. The virtues they claim to uphold and defend, usually in the name of superior civilization, are amassed for pillage, the exploitation of cheap labor, and indiscriminate violence and state terror. Particularly the superior civilization thing, there's obviously a lot of racism and kind of white supremacy embedded in having that type of, savior complex, right? Current American empire, damaged and humiliated by the troves of internal documents published by WikiLeaks, will, for this reason, persecute Julian Assange for the rest of life. We've seen that continue to happen under Biden, to no surprise, unfortunately. It does not matter who's president or which political party is in power. Imperialists speak with one voice. And also say, I revert back to Lenin and as imperialism being the highest stage of capitalism, right? Does not matter who is president, which political party is in power. Imperialists speak with one voice. The killing of 13 U.S. troops by suicide bomber at the Hamid Karzai airport in Kabul on Thursday evoked from Joe Biden the full-throated cry of all imperialists. To those who carried out this attack, we will not forgive, we will not forget, we will hunt you down and make you pay. This was swiftly followed by 2 drone strikes in Kabul against suspected members of ISIS-K, which there's some evidence that the U.S. has actually been flying these ISIS-K figures into Afghanistan from other countries, which took credit for the suicide bombing, left 170 dead, including 28 members of the Taliban. But you're not going to hear about that part in mainstream media. They're only going to focus on the 13 U.S. troops that died. The Taliban, which defeated the U.S. coalition forces' 20-year war, is about to be confronted with the wrath of a wounded empire. The Cuban, Vietnamese, Iranian, Venezuelan, Haitian governments know what comes next. The ghosts of Toussaint Louverture, that would be the Haitian context, right? Emilio Aguinaldo, Mohammed Mossadegh, that's Iran. Jacob Arbenz, that would be Arbenz. Where was Arbenz? Somewhere in South America. Was it Venezuela? Not sure. Let me know if you know down below. Omar Torrijos, Gamal Abdel Nasser, that's Egypt, Juan Velasco, Salvador Allende, Chile, Andreas Papandreou, Juan Bosch, Patrice Lumumba, Hugo Chavez. Know what comes next. It isn't pretty. Be paid for by the poorest and most vulnerable Afghans. Again, that's always going to be the case, for imperialism, the acts of the U.S. empire. It's always going to be the most vulnerable and marginalized people and groups that feel the full, force of these disastrous, foreign policy choices. The faux pity for the Afghan people, which has defined the coverage of the desperate collaborators with the U.S. and coalition occupying forces and educated elites fleeing to the Kabul airport, begins and ends with the plight of the evacuees. There were tears shed for the families routinely terrorized. There were few tears shed for the families routinely terrorized by coalition forces, or the some 70,000 civilians who were obliterated by U.S. airstrikes, drone attacks, missiles, and artillery gunned down by nervous occupying forces who saw every Afghan with some justification as enemy during the war. And I would argue that 70,000 figure is probably quite low. One thing I noticed too, why is Hedges not cited any sources? Kind of interesting, right? What's going on with that, Hedges? Put your sources in the document, whether APA or just link it in there, whatever you got to do. And then there will be the few tears for the humanitarian catastrophe that empire is orchestrating on the 38 million Afghans who live in one of the poorest and most aid-dependent countries in the world. And as the result of the U.S. getting out, all of these sanctions will now be put in place, making it extremely difficult to actually get humanitarian aid into Afghanistan to people who need it the most, further exacerbating this crisis that the U.S. again created. Since the 2001 invasion, the U.S. deployed about 775,000 military personnel to subdue Afghanistan and poured $143 billion in the country. I'm pretty sure that figure's wrong. I heard something over $2.5 trillion. That number sounds way low, with 60% of the money going to prop up the corrupt Afghan military and the rest devoted funding economic development projects, aid programs, and anti-drug initiatives, with the bulk of those funds being siphoned off by foreign aid groups, private contractors, outside consultants. And again, the corruption within this, U.S. puppet government was definitely one of the reasons that the Taliban was able to regain control of the country so quickly. Because they're completely corrupt. The people didn't have any faith or trust in that system, and it fell like a deck of cards, predictably. Grants from the U.S. and other countries accounted for 75% of Afghan government budget. Assistance has evaporated. Afghanistan's reserve and other financial accounts have been frozen, meaning the new government cannot access some $9.5 billion in assets belonging to the Afghan central bank. Shipments of cash to Afghanistan have been stopped. The IMF announced that Afghanistan will no longer be able to access the lender's research. Look at this. I mean, all of these funding sources that could be, used for helping out, humanitarian ways are being cut off from the country when they absolutely need it the most. And this is what Hedges is getting at, how empires, never forgive. Things are already dire. There are 14 million Afghans, one in three, who lack sufficient food. There are 2 million Afghan children who are malnourished. There are 3.5 people in Afghanistan who have been displaced from their homes. The war has wrecked infrastructure. Drought destroyed 40% of the nation's crops last year. The salt in the Afghan economy is already seeing food prices skyrocket. The sanctions and severance of aid will force civil servants to go without salaries, and the health service, already chronically short of medicine and equipment, will collapse. The suffering orchestrated by the empire will be of biblical proportions, and this is what the empire wants. Yet saying, whoever resists us, we may be in your country, occupying it for 20 years, killing indiscriminately civilians, men, women, and children. We're going to make your life a living hell for that 20 years, but as soon as we get out, it's going to be even worse. Empire doesn't forgive. He's right. UNICEF estimates that 500,000 children were killed as a direct result of sanctions on Iraq. And he goes into how, you know, Madeleine Albright was a sacrifice it was worth it. And that, you know, that's the Madeleine Albright, you know, who Hannah Kasparian of TYT fame gave that softball interview to. And talking about Hillary Clinton, joking about, you know, the murder of Muammar Gaddafi in a really just brutal way. No matter that the empire has since turned Libya into, along with Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, into cauldrons of violence, chaos, and misery, the power to destroy is an intoxicating drug. That's its own justification. Like Cato the Censor, the U.S. military intelligence agencies are, if history is any guide, at this moment planning to destabilize Afghanistan by funding, arming, and backing any militia, warlord, or terrorist or willing to strike at the Taliban. The CIA, which exclusively gather intelligence, or I would say not exist at all, frankly. I think he's being a little bit too generous there. Is a rogue paramilitary org that oversees secret kidnappings, interrogations at black sites, torture, manhunts, target assassinations across the globe, carried out commando raids in Afghanistan that killed a large number of Afghan civilians, which repeatedly sent enraged family members and villagers into the arms of the Taliban. It is, I suspect, reaching out to Amrullah Salah, who is Ashraf Ghani's vice president. Again, Ashraf Ghani was the former president of Afghanistan who fled the country as soon as, you know, kind of the writing was on the wall that the U.S. was out. The Taliban was going to come back in. The legitimate caretaker president of Afghanistan, Saleh, is holed up in the Pandjshir Valley. He, along with warlords Afghan Masood, Mohammed Atanur, and Abdul Rashid Dostum, are clamoring to be armed and supported to perpetuate conflict in Afghanistan. Right from the Panjshir Valley today, ready to follow my father's footsteps with Mujahideen fighters who are prepared to once again take on the Taliban. Ahmed Masood wrote an opinion piece in WAPO. The United States and its allies have left the battlefield, but America can still be a great arsenal of democracy. Wow. Interesting. Talking about how the U.S. spent $9 billion arming the Mujahideen so they could, you know, fight the Soviets, drawing them into that, you know, conflict. 1 million Afghan civilians were killed in the 9-year conflict with the Soviets. Wow. Brezhnev, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, going into the strategy of why they were trying to get the USSR entangled in Afghanistan. This pattern of behavior which destabilized Afghanistan and the region is reflexive in the military and intelligence community. It will without a doubt be repeated now in Afghanistan with the same catastrophic results. The chaos these intelligence agencies create becomes a chaos that justifies their existence, and the chaos that sees them demand more and more resources. This kind of really, you know, deadly destructive loop. All empires die. The end is usually unpleasant. Is blind to its own declining strength. Is it blind to it, or is it knows, you know, no other way of existing, because it kind of has to keep, you know, fighting to perpetuate itself, or it will die. So it kind of has to have that, you know, tunnel vision. Let's see. Chalmers Johnson. He talks about Chalmers Johnson quite a bit. Reminds readers that the Greek goddess Nemesis is a spirit of retribution, a corrective to the greed and stupidity that sometimes governs relations among people. She stands for righteous anger, a deity who punishes human transgressions of the natural right order of things and the arrogance that causes it. He warns that if we continue to cling to our empires, the Roman Republic did, we'll certainly lose our democracy, grimly await the eventual blowback that imperialism generates. I would push back a little bit there against Chalmers and say that the United States have never had a democracy. We clearly don't now. Chalmers Johnson thinking, if we don't end this, empire, we're going to create a military dictatorship or civilian equivalent. About the founders. Last paragraph, we'll end it here. If the empire is capable of introspection and forgiveness, it could free itself from death spiral. If the empire disbanded, much as the British Empire did, and retreated to focus on the ills that beset the United States, it could free itself from the death spiral. But those who manipulate the levers of empire are unaccountable. They are hidden from public view and beyond public scrutiny. They are determined to keep playing the great game, rolling the dice with lives and national treasure. They will, I expect, preside gleefully over the deaths of even more Afghans, assuring themselves it is worth it without realizing that the gallows they erect are for themselves. Pretty interesting piece here. Again, I don't agree with everything that was in it, but still pretty insightful and interesting nonetheless. And yeah, we definitely... as one of the very few things good that Biden has done is in office is get out of, Afghanistan. Should never been there in the first place. We've caused so much suffering, destruction, and death for the people of Afghanistan and that region in general. And once the U.S. pulls out, as Hedges points out, this suffering is not going to be any lessened for the people of Afghanistan, especially the most vulnerable and marginalized groups and people. It's actually, in fact, going to be made worse. As he points out in this article, it's going to be a lot harder to get humanitarian aid in the country. They're no longer able to access money from the Afghan central bank, their own money. They don't have access to it. No longer getting any support from the IMF. So again, just because the U.S. is pulling out militarily does not mean the suffering of the Afghan people will be any less. As Hedges points out, empires do not forget or forgive, and this is definitely very true, with some very disastrous and sad consequences for people in Afghanistan and everywhere and everybody else in the world who's under the boot of the U.S. empire, right? Like the video if you like the damn video. Subscribe for more content. There's Christy.
Hi.
Peace.